The morning of October 23, 1943, Lieutenant Commander James Dutch Sullivan gripped the controls of his F-6F Hellcat as the USS Essex pitched violently in 12-foot swells somewhere north of the Marshall Islands. Steam hissed from the catapult deck as saltwater spray mixed with aviation fuel created a slick, treacherous surface beneath the wheels of his fighter. The standard launch procedure called for a straight-ahead acceleration down the flight deck, but Dutch had been studying the wind patterns for weeks, calculating angles that no flight manual had ever considered. His squadron mates thought he was crazy. His commanding officer had explicitly forbidden any deviation from established protocol. But as Dutch watched 3 Japanese Betty bombers approaching the task force at wavetop level, he made a decision that would violate every regulation he had sworn to follow. He angled his Hellcat 15 degrees to starboard, applied power in a sequence that defied physics, and prepared to launch sideways off the carrier deck. The deck crew froze in disbelief. The air boss screamed into his radio, and somewhere in the back of Dutch's mind, a voice whispered that this moment would either make him a hero or get him court-martialed for the most spectacular failure in naval aviation history. No one in Fighting Squadron 15 knew that one man's refusal to follow orders that morning would revolutionize carrier tactics and save thousands of American lives before the war ended. James Sullivan had grown up in the wheat fields of Kansas, about as far from the ocean as a boy could get without crossing into Colorado. Born in Topeka on a February morning in 1918, when the snow was so thick his father had to deliver him because the doctor couldn't make it through the drifts, Dutch learned early that sometimes you had to improvise when the established way wouldn't work. His father ran a small aircraft repair shop at the local airfield, one of those ramshackle operations that survived on fixing crop dusters and mail planes with whatever parts could be scavenged or fabricated. Dutch spent his afternoons after school watching his father coax life back into engines that should have been scrapped years earlier, learning that rules were often just suggestions and that innovation came from necessity rather than textbooks. When he was 16, Dutch took apart a Curtiss Jennings engine and reassembled it with modifications that increased its power output by 20%, using nothing but spare parts from a Model T Ford and his own understanding of airflow dynamics. His father shook his head and muttered something about book learning versus common sense, but Dutch could see the pride in the old man's eyes. The summer before his senior year of high school, Dutch soloed in that same Jenny, but instead of following the standard traffic pattern, he developed his own approach that compensated for the crosswinds that plagued their prairie airfield. Other pilots began asking him to teach them his technique. He had no idea that those same instincts for seeing problems from unexpected angles would one day make him the most unconventional pilot in the Pacific Fleet. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Dutch was in his second year at Kansas State studying engineering. But within a week he had walked into the Navy recruiting station in Manhattan, Kansas, and volunteered for flight training. The recruiting chief, a grizzled petty officer who had seen farm boys come and go for 20 years, took one look at Dutch's logbook and recommended him for the accelerated pilot program at Pensacola. Dutch arrived in Florida 3 weeks later carrying a canvas bag, $47, and a letter from his father that simply read, "Make us proud, son. But don't forget that sometimes the best way forward isn't straight ahead." Flight training at Pensacola was designed to weed out the dreamers and the reckless, leaving only pilots who could follow orders precisely and execute maneuvers exactly as taught. Dutch excelled at the technical aspects, finishing third in his class in navigation and first in aircraft systems, but his instructors noted in his file that he had an unfortunate tendency to overthink standard procedures and propose unnecessary modifications. When he suggested that the Stearman trainers could achieve better performance in crosswinds by adjusting the approach angle, his flight instructor told him that thousands of pilots had learned to fly using established methods and that innovation was the enemy of consistency. Dutch nodded respectfully and continued practicing the approved techniques, but in his spare time, he filled notebook after notebook with calculations about wind vectors, power curves, and unconventional approaches to common problems. His classmates thought he was studying too hard, but Dutch was actually designing solutions to problems that hadn't occurred yet. He graduated from flight training in August of 1942 and was assigned to Fighting Squadron 15 aboard the USS Essex, where his reputation as a brilliant pilot with dangerous ideas preceded him by several weeks. The Pacific Theater in 1943 was a vast chess game played across thousands of miles of ocean, where American forces were methodically advancing toward Japan through a series of island-hopping campaigns that required absolute coordination between naval, air, and ground forces. The Essex-class carriers represented the newest generation of American naval power, capable of launching 90 aircraft in coordinated strikes that could devastate enemy installations hundreds of miles away. But the effectiveness of carrier operations depended entirely on the ability to launch and recover aircraft efficiently, even in rough seas and under enemy fire. Standard launch procedures had been developed through years of testing and refinement, designed to maximize safety and minimize the time aircraft spent exposed on deck during combat operations. Every pilot learned the same sequence: align with the catapult track, apply full power, release brakes on signal, and accelerate straight ahead until airborne. The system worked, but it also required perfect weather conditions and assumed that enemy aircraft would attack from predictable directions. By October of 1943, Japanese forces had adapted their tactics to exploit the predictable nature of American carrier operations, timing their attacks to catch aircraft during the vulnerable moments of launch and recovery. Dutch had been studying after-action reports and meteorological data for months, convinced that there had to be a better way to get aircraft airborne when conditions weren't perfect. His calculations suggested that by launching at an angle to the deck and compensating for crosswinds through precise power management, pilots could achieve flight in conditions that would normally ground operations. The theory was sound, but testing it would require violating explicit orders and risking not just his own life but the lives of everyone on the flight deck. He knew that if he was wrong, the consequences would be catastrophic. Fighting Squadron 15 was composed of 18 F-6F Hellcats and pilots from every corner of America, men who had left behind farms, factories, and college dormitories to learn the deadly art of carrier aviation. Dutch's wingman was Lieutenant Bobby Chen, a Chinese-American pilot from San Francisco whose parents had fled China during the Revolution and who fought with the quiet determination of someone defending two homelands simultaneously. Their section leader was Lieutenant Tom Bradley, a former crop duster from Alabama who could land a Hellcat on a postage stamp but had never quite mastered the art of following orders without questioning them first. The squadron commander, Commander Robert Iron Mike Morrison, was a former test pilot who had survived 3 carrier landings with damaged aircraft and believed that discipline and standardization were the only things standing between his pilots and the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Morrison had specifically warned Dutch about his tendency to overthink simple procedures, telling him during their first meeting that innovation was fine in peacetime, but that combat required absolute adherence to proven methods. Dutch respected Morrison and understood his logic, but he also knew that the Japanese weren't following American protocols, and that sometimes survival required thinking beyond the boundaries of standard operating procedures. The tension between innovation and discipline created a constant undercurrent in squadron operations, with pilots caught between the need to follow orders and the reality that war rarely unfolded according to textbook scenarios. Dutch had shared his theories about angled launches with Bobby and Tom during late-night conversations in the ready room, but both men were skeptical about the wisdom of experimenting with fundamental flight procedures while operating hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly airfield. They understood his reasoning, but worried that one miscalculation could result in a crash that would not only kill Dutch, but potentially damage the flight deck and endanger other aircraft. Still, they had seen enough combat to know that conventional wisdom didn't always survive contact with reality, and they began to wonder if Dutch's unconventional ideas might actually save lives when traditional methods failed. The morning of October 23rd began with weather conditions that pushed the limits of acceptable flight operations, but intelligence reports indicated that a Japanese task force was approaching the American formation and that immediate air cover was essential regardless of sea state. The Essex was pitching and rolling in swells that made standard launches dangerous, and several pilots had already been waved off due to unstable deck conditions. Dutch was scheduled for the third launch wave, but as he watched the first two attempts result in near crashes and aborted takeoffs, he realized that continuing to follow standard procedures might result in no aircraft getting airborne at all. The Japanese bombers were approaching from the northeast, using cloud cover to mask their advance, and radar operators estimated they would be within striking distance in less than 20 minutes. Commander Morrison was under enormous pressure to get fighters airborne, but he was also responsible for the safety of his pilots and the integrity of his aircraft. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, with weather conditions making standard launches increasingly impossible, while the tactical situation demanded immediate response. Dutch approached Morrison with his proposal to attempt an angled launch, explaining his calculations and offering to test the procedure himself rather than risk other pilots. Morrison's initial response was predictably negative, citing regulations and safety concerns, but as the tactical situation worsened and more launch attempts failed, he began to consider options that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The conversation was interrupted by reports that Japanese aircraft had been spotted on radar, closing fast and apparently timing their attack to coincide with the Americans' inability to launch effective air cover. Dutch could see the conflict in Morrison's eyes as duty warred with caution, regulations clashed with necessity, and the weight of command forced impossible decisions. Finally, Morrison gave Dutch permission to attempt one experimental launch, with the understanding that success or failure would determine whether other pilots followed his example, or whether the entire squadron would wait for better weather, while enemy bombers approached unopposed. The fate of the task force might depend on whether one pilot's unproven theory could work in the most challenging conditions imaginable. Dutch climbed into his Hellcat with a mixture of confidence and terror that every test pilot learns to manage, knowing that the next few minutes would either validate months of theoretical work or demonstrate why military procedures existed in the first place. His pre-flight check revealed that all systems were functioning normally, but the aircraft would be operating at the absolute limits of its performance envelope if his calculations were correct. The flight deck crew was skeptical but professional, making the necessary adjustments to catapult settings and deck configuration while expressing their doubts through worried glances and whispered conversations. Bobby Chen and Tom Bradley positioned their aircraft for conventional launches, ready to follow Dutch if his experiment succeeded, or to abort their own takeoffs if his ended in disaster. The deck was slick with spray, creating conditions that would challenge even experienced pilots using standard procedures, and Dutch's unconventional approach would require split-second timing and precise control inputs that had never been tested under actual flight conditions. As he taxied into position, Dutch could feel the eyes of the entire deck crew watching his every move, knowing that their confidence in naval aviation procedures was about to be either reinforced or shattered by what happened next. The catapult officer looked skeptical, but followed Dutch's instructions to adjust the launch angle, creating a configuration that violated every regulation in the flight operations manual, but matched the precise specifications Dutch had calculated for these wind and sea conditions. Engine run-up revealed normal parameters, but Dutch knew that the real test would come when he released the brakes and committed to a launch sequence that no pilot had ever attempted from a carrier deck. The Japanese bombers were now visible on the horizon, approaching in formation, and apparently confident that American fighters would be unable to intercept them due to the rough weather conditions. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio, asking Dutch for a final confirmation that he was ready to proceed with what might be the most dangerous launch attempt in naval aviation history. Dutch keyed his microphone, took a deep breath that tasted of salt spray and aviation fuel, and replied that he was ready to prove that sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to follow them effectively. The catapult launch sequence began exactly as Dutch had rehearsed it in his mind hundreds of times, but the reality of executing an untested procedure while operating from a pitching deck in heavy seas introduced variables that no amount of calculation could fully predict. As steam pressure built in the catapult system, Dutch adjusted his control inputs to compensate for the angled deck position, applying rudder and aileron corrections that felt completely wrong according to standard training. but matched his theoretical calculations for this specific configuration. The deck crew watched in fascination and horror as Dutch's Hellcat aligned at an angle that seemed guaranteed to send the aircraft sliding sideways off the deck rather than accelerating toward flying speed. Morrison held his breath as Dutch applied full military power, causing the Hellcat's engine to roar with a sound that seemed to shake the entire ship, while the aircraft strained against the catapult holdback that was the only thing preventing an immediate disaster. The launch officer raised his flag, paused for a moment that seemed to last forever, and then signaled the catapult release that would either validate Dutch's theory or create the most spectacular crash in carrier aviation history. What happened next defied every expectation and challenged every assumption about the relationship between aircraft performance and flight deck procedures. Instead of sliding sideways into the ocean or stalling immediately after leaving the deck, Dutch's Hellcat accelerated at an angle that compensated perfectly for the crosswinds that had been preventing conventional launches all morning. The aircraft achieved flying speed in a shorter distance than normal launches required, lifted off cleanly despite the pitching deck, and climbed away at an angle that positioned Dutch perfectly to intercept the approaching Japanese bombers. The deck crew erupted in cheers that could be heard over the wind and waves, while Morrison stared in amazement at a launch sequence that should have been impossible according to everything he thought he knew about carrier operations. Bobby Chen and Tom Bradley immediately requested permission to attempt similar launches, confident that Dutch's success had proven the viability of procedures that seemed to violate the laws of physics, but actually represented a more sophisticated understanding of how aircraft performance could be optimized for specific conditions. The air battle that followed became a textbook example of how tactical innovation could transform impossible situations into decisive victories. But Dutch's focus remained entirely on the immediate problem of intercepting enemy bombers before they could damage American ships. His angled launch had positioned him perfectly to approach the Japanese formation from an unexpected direction, allowing him to achieve surprise despite being outnumbered 3-1. The lead Betty bomber was configured for torpedo attack, flying low and slow in preparation for a run against the Essex, but the pilot had not anticipated facing American fighters under these weather conditions. Dutch's opening burst of .50 caliber fire destroyed the bomber's port engine and sent it spiraling into the ocean, while his wingmen engaged the remaining aircraft with deadly effectiveness. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 minutes, but in that time, Dutch and his section destroyed all 3 enemy bombers and demonstrated that weather conditions that prevented conventional operations could actually become tactical advantages when approached with sufficient innovation and skill. The Japanese pilots had counted on American adherence to standard procedures, timing their attack to exploit the predictable limitations of carrier operations in rough seas. Dutch's unconventional launch had disrupted their entire tactical plan, proving that flexibility and adaptation could overcome superior numbers when applied at the right moment. As Dutch formed up with his wingmen for the return to the Essex, he realized that he had not only saved the task force from enemy attack, but had also demonstrated the validity of theoretical concepts that could revolutionize carrier aviation tactics. The immediate tactical victory was satisfying, but the long-term implications of his successful angled launch would prove even more significant as word of his achievement spread throughout the Pacific Fleet. Morrison's voice came through the radio with congratulations and instructions to prepare for immediate landing. But Dutch could hear something else in his commander's tone that suggested this single flight had changed more than just the outcome of one air battle. The carrier landing that followed required Dutch to demonstrate that his innovations extended beyond launch procedures to encompass the entire cycle of carrier operations, including the critical phase of deck recovery under challenging conditions. The Essex was still pitching heavily in the rough seas, and the angled approach that had made his launch possible now complicated his landing in ways that standard procedures had never anticipated. Dutch had to compensate for crosswinds and deck motion while approaching from an angle that required precise timing and coordination with the landing signal officer, who was also improvising procedures in real time. The successful trap that followed proved that Dutch's understanding of carrier operations encompassed both ends of the flight cycle, validating his theoretical work with practical demonstrations that other pilots could observe and potentially replicate. As he taxied clear of the landing area, Dutch could see deck crews preparing to reconfigure the catapult system for additional angled launches, suggesting that his experimental procedure was already being integrated into standard operations. Bobby Chen and Tom Bradley landed moments later, both reporting that the angled launch sequence had been easier to execute than conventional procedures under these conditions, and recommending immediate adoption of Dutch's methods for similar weather situations. The debriefing that followed lasted 3 hours and included detailed technical discussions of flight parameters, deck configurations, and tactical implications that extended far beyond the immediate success of one experimental launch. Morrison had already contacted the task force commander and the Bureau of Aeronautics, describing Dutch's innovation in terms that suggested its potential application throughout the carrier force. Dutch found himself in the unusual position of having proven that disobedience could be more effective than compliance when circumstances required thinking beyond established limitations. The mathematics of his success were undeniable. 3 enemy bombers destroyed, 0 American casualties, and a new tactical capability that could transform carrier operations under adverse conditions. He had broken regulations to save lives, violated procedures to achieve victory, and demonstrated that innovation often required the courage to challenge authority when conventional wisdom proved inadequate to meet evolving threats. The weeks that followed brought a stream of visitors to the Essex, as word of Dutch's angled launch technique spread through the Pacific Fleet and attracted attention from tactical development specialists, test pilots, and senior commanders who recognized its potential implications for carrier warfare. Dutch found himself spending more time in briefing rooms than cockpits, explaining the theoretical basis for his procedures to audiences of increasingly senior officers who wanted to understand how one pilot's innovation had solved problems that had been limiting carrier effectiveness for months. The calculations that had begun as idle speculation in his notebook were now being studied by aeronautical engineers and tactical specialists who confirmed that Dutch's intuitive understanding of aircraft performance had led him to solutions that formal research programs had been seeking unsuccessfully. Captain William Bull Halsey himself visited the Essex in early November, specifically requesting a demonstration of the angled launch technique and a personal briefing from the pilot who had developed it. Dutch was nervous about briefing such a senior officer, but Halsey proved to be genuinely interested in tactical innovation and asked detailed questions about applications and limitations that demonstrated his understanding of operational requirements. The conversation lasted 2 hours and covered topics ranging from pilot training protocols to fleet-wide implementation strategies, with Halsey taking extensive notes and asking Dutch to prepare written recommendations for modification of existing procedures. By December, Dutch's techniques were being taught at flight training schools and incorporated into operational manuals. But the man who had developed them remained focused on his primary mission of flying combat patrols and engaging enemy aircraft whenever the opportunity arose. His squadron mates had initially been skeptical of his unconventional methods, but their attitudes changed dramatically after witnessing the effectiveness of procedures that seemed to violate common sense while delivering superior results. Tom Bradley became Dutch's most enthusiastic advocate, mastering the angled launch technique and developing his own modifications that further improved performance under specific conditions. Bobby Chen focused on adapting the procedures for different aircraft types, discovering that the principles Dutch had developed for the Hellcat could be applied to dive bombers and torpedo planes with equally impressive results. Commander Morrison submitted official reports recommending Dutch for promotion and recognition, but he also ensured that credit was shared with the entire squadron for their willingness to support experimental procedures under combat conditions. The broader impact of Dutch's innovation extended far beyond the tactical level, as naval aviation specialists recognized that his angled launch technique represented a fundamental shift in thinking about carrier operations that could influence aircraft design, deck configuration, and pilot training for decades to come. The success of unconventional procedures under adverse conditions challenged assumptions about the relationship between standardization and effectiveness, suggesting that rigid adherence to established methods might actually limit operational capability when circumstances required adaptive responses. Dutch's notebooks, filled with calculations and observations that had seemed like idle speculation to his squadron mates, became the foundation for research programs that explored the mathematical relationships between wind vectors, deck angles, and aircraft performance under a wide range of conditions. The theoretical framework that had enabled his breakthrough was soon being applied to problems ranging from night operations to high-altitude launches, with consistently impressive results that validated the value of innovation over conformity. Naval aviation schools began teaching courses in tactical adaptation that used Dutch's example to illustrate the importance of understanding principles rather than simply memorizing procedures, encouraging future pilots to think creatively about solutions to operational challenges. The angled launch technique itself was refined and standardized, becoming part of normal carrier operations by 1944, but its development had also established a culture of innovation that encouraged pilots to question assumptions and propose improvements to existing methods. Dutch's willingness to risk his career and his life to test unproven theories had demonstrated that progress often required individuals to challenge authority when institutional inertia prevented adaptation to changing circumstances. The Japanese response to American tactical innovations revealed that Dutch's breakthrough had forced enemy forces to completely revise their approach to attacking carrier task forces, abandoning timing-based strategies that had exploited predictable American procedures in favor of more complex approaches that acknowledged the new flexibility of carrier operations. Intelligence reports from captured documents indicated that Japanese commanders were specifically concerned about American pilots who seemed to operate outside established parameters, creating unpredictable tactical situations that complicated attack planning and reduced the effectiveness of coordinated strikes. The strategic implications of one pilot's innovation had rippled throughout the Pacific theater, influencing not only American tactics but also enemy strategy in ways that continued to advantage Allied forces for the remainder of the war. Dutch Sullivan returned to Kansas in November of 1945 with a Distinguished Flying Cross, 3 air medals, and a reputation as one of the most innovative pilots in naval aviation history. But his homecoming was typically understated for a man who had never sought attention for his achievements. His father was waiting at the train station in Topeka, looking older, but still carrying himself with the quiet dignity that Dutch remembered from childhood, and their reunion consisted of a handshake, a brief hug, and a few words about how good it was to have him home safely. The wheat fields looked exactly as Dutch had left them 4 years earlier, but his perspective on problems and solutions had been fundamentally changed by experiences that had taught him the value of thinking independently, while accepting responsibility for the consequences of unconventional decisions. He enrolled at Kansas State using the GI Bill, completing his engineering degree while working part-time at his father's aircraft repair shop, where his wartime experience with high-performance aircraft made him invaluable for troubleshooting complex mechanical problems. Dutch married his high school sweetheart Sarah Mitchell in June of 1946, and they settled into a quiet life that bore no external resemblance to the dramatic events that had made him famous among naval aviators. He rarely spoke about the war, even with Sarah, preferring to focus on civilian challenges that seemed mundane compared to carrier operations in the Pacific, but still required the same analytical approach that had characterized his military service. Local newspapers occasionally mentioned his wartime achievements, but Dutch always declined interviews and deflected credit to his squadron mates and superior officers, maintaining that individual recognition was inappropriate for achievements that had depended on team effort and institutional support. The angled launch technique that had made him famous was now standard procedure throughout the Navy, but Dutch took more satisfaction from solving agricultural aviation problems that helped local farmers improve crop yields and reduce operational costs. He established his own aircraft service company in 1949, specializing in modifications and improvements that reflected his continuing belief that established procedures were starting points for innovation rather than final solutions to complex problems. Sarah often found him in his workshop late at night, sketching aircraft modifications, or calculating performance improvements with the same intensity that had characterized his wartime notebooks. But now his innovations served civilian purposes that contributed to peacetime prosperity rather than military effectiveness. The Korean War brought renewed interest in Dutch's tactical innovations as a new generation of naval aviators faced combat conditions that required adaptation of procedures developed during World War II. But Dutch himself remained focused on civilian applications of aviation technology that seemed more important to him than military recognition. He received letters from former squadron mates who were serving in Korea, describing how angled launch techniques had evolved to accommodate jet aircraft and more sophisticated carrier operations. But he declined invitations to serve as a consultant or instructor for the new procedures. His contribution to aviation had been made during the war, and he believed that further development should be left to active duty personnel who understood current operational requirements better than veterans who had moved on to civilian careers. Dutch's aircraft service company prospered throughout the 1950s, earning a reputation for innovative solutions to complex problems that attracted customers from throughout the Midwest. But his most satisfying work involved teaching young mechanics and pilots the same analytical approach that had enabled his wartime breakthrough. He established an apprenticeship program that emphasized understanding principles rather than memorizing procedures, encouraging students to question assumptions and develop their own solutions to technical challenges rather than simply following established methods. Many of his apprentices went on to successful careers in aviation, carrying forward the lessons they had learned about the value of innovative thinking and the importance of taking calculated risks when conventional approaches proved inadequate. Dutch's influence on aviation continued through these students long after his own military service had ended, creating a legacy of innovation that extended far beyond the specific tactical breakthrough that had made him famous. Sarah often observed that her husband seemed happiest when teaching young people to think independently, suggesting that his real satisfaction came from enabling others to achieve their potential, rather than from personal recognition for his own achievements. The modesty that had characterized his response to wartime fame became a defining feature of his civilian career, as he consistently prioritized the success of others over his own advancement and focused on contributions to his community rather than national recognition for past accomplishments. The 1960s brought changes to both aviation technology and American society that reflected the same spirit of innovation and challenge to authority that had characterized Dutch's wartime breakthrough. But he remained focused on practical applications of engineering principles rather than political or social movements. His aircraft service company had grown into one of the most respected operations in the Midwest, known for developing solutions to problems that other facilities considered impossible, and Dutch's reputation for innovative thinking attracted customers from as far away as California and Florida. He expanded into aircraft modification and experimental design, working with pilots and aircraft owners to develop customized solutions that improve performance, safety, or operational efficiency in ways that reflected his continuing belief in the value of thinking beyond established limitations. The Federal Aviation Administration occasionally consulted with Dutch on safety and performance issues, recognizing that his analytical approach and practical experience provided insights that complemented formal research and development programs. But he always insisted that his contributions be credited to collaborative efforts rather than individual achievement. His workshop became an informal gathering place for local pilots and aviation enthusiasts who appreciated his willingness to share knowledge and his ability to explain complex technical concepts in terms that non-experts could understand and apply to their own projects. Dutch's teaching methods emphasized the importance of understanding fundamental principles rather than memorizing specific procedures, encouraging students to develop the same analytical skills that had enabled his wartime innovation and preparing them to solve problems that had not yet been identified. Sarah noted that her husband seemed to derive more satisfaction from helping others achieve their goals than from pursuing his own projects, suggesting that his real calling had always been as an educator rather than as a famous pilot or innovative engineer. The couple never had children of their own, But Dutch's apprentices and students became an extended family that reflected his values and continued his approach to problem-solving long after they had moved on to their own careers. Local high schools began sending students to Dutch's workshop for hands-on experience with aircraft maintenance and modification, creating an informal educational program that produced more than 100 young people who went on to careers in aviation, engineering, and related technical fields. Dutch Sullivan died quietly in his sleep on March 15, 1987, at the age of 69, having lived a life that demonstrated the lasting value of innovation, courage, and dedication to helping others achieve their potential. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had influenced, including former squadron mates, apprentices, customers, and students who had learned from his example that individual initiative could make a significant difference when applied with skill and determination. The eulogy was delivered by Tom Bradley, now a retired admiral, who described Dutch as a man who had proven that following orders was important, but that knowing when to break them was the mark of true leadership and moral courage. Bobby Chen, who had flown as Dutch's wingman during the war and maintained a lifelong friendship despite living on opposite coasts, spoke about Dutch's humility and his consistent focus on the success of others rather than personal recognition for his own achievements. Commander Morrison, approaching 90 but still sharp, attended the service despite his age and declining health, telling anyone who would listen that Dutch Sullivan had been the finest pilot and the best man he had ever served with, combining technical brilliance with moral character in ways that defined the highest traditions of naval aviation. The local newspaper published a lengthy obituary that detailed Dutch's wartime service and his contributions to civilian aviation, but the article emphasized his role as a teacher and mentor rather than his tactical innovations, reflecting his own priorities and the way he had chosen to live his life after the war ended. Sarah established a scholarship fund in Dutch's memory, providing financial assistance for young people who wanted to pursue careers in aviation or engineering but lacked the resources to attend college or technical schools, ensuring that his commitment to education would continue to benefit future generations. The scholarship recipients were selected based on their demonstration of the same qualities that had characterized Dutch's approach to problem-solving: intellectual curiosity, willingness to challenge conventional thinking, and dedication to using their skills to help others rather than simply advancing their own careers. The first awards were presented in 1988, and by 2005, more than 300 students had received assistance that enabled them to pursue education and training that might otherwise have been impossible, creating a living legacy that reflected Dutch's values and continued his influence on American aviation. The technical legacy of Dutch Sullivan's angled launch technique became part of standard naval aviation doctrine and influenced aircraft carrier design for decades after World War II, but its broader significance lay in demonstrating that individual innovation could transform institutional practices when applied with sufficient courage and skill. Modern carrier operations still employ principles that Dutch developed through his theoretical calculations and practical testing, though the technology has evolved far beyond anything he could have imagined during the war. The FA-18 Super Hornets that operate from contemporary aircraft carriers launch using procedures that reflect lessons learned from Dutch's breakthrough, proving that fundamental insights into the relationship between aircraft performance and operational environment remain relevant despite enormous changes in technology and tactical requirements. Naval aviation training programs continue to use Dutch's example to illustrate the importance of understanding principles rather than simply memorizing procedures, encouraging pilots to think creatively about solutions to operational challenges while accepting responsibility for the consequences of their decisions. The mathematical framework that enabled Dutch's innovation has been refined and expanded through decades of research and development, but its core insights about the relationship between wind vectors, deck angles, and aircraft performance remain valid and continue to influence carrier operations throughout the world. Air Force and civilian aviation have also adopted principles derived from Dutch's work, applying his analytical approach to problems ranging from short-field takeoffs to high-altitude operations in ways that demonstrate the universal applicability of innovative thinking to complex technical challenges. The culture of innovation that Dutch's example helped establish within naval aviation has produced countless additional breakthroughs that have improved safety, effectiveness, and efficiency in ways that save lives and resources while advancing the state-of-the-art in military and civilian flying. His willingness to challenge authority when circumstances required thinking beyond established limitations became a model for future generations of aviators who faced similar situations where conventional wisdom proved inadequate to meet evolving threats or opportunities. The courage to risk career and reputation in pursuit of better solutions remains as relevant today as it was during World War II, suggesting that Dutch's example continues to inspire people who face the choice between safe conformity and dangerous innovation in pursuit of worthy goals. Today, more than 75 years after Lieutenant Commander James Sullivan proved that sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to follow them effectively, his story serves as a reminder that progress often depends on individuals who have the courage to challenge assumptions and the skill to implement better solutions despite institutional resistance. The angled launch technique that seemed impossible to experienced pilots and dangerous to commanding officers became standard practice throughout the Navy within 2 years of its first successful demonstration, proving that innovation often appears radical only until its effectiveness becomes undeniable. Dutch's example illustrates the eternal tension between authority and initiative, between safety and progress, between following orders and achieving mission success when circumstances require thinking beyond established parameters. His story demonstrates that true leadership often consists of knowing when to disobey orders in pursuit of higher goals, accepting personal responsibility for the consequences of unconventional decisions, and sharing credit for success with the team members who made achievement possible. The mathematical precision that enabled Dutch's breakthrough required not only technical knowledge, but also the courage to test theoretical calculations under conditions where failure would have catastrophic consequences, illustrating the relationship between intellectual understanding and practical application that characterizes all meaningful innovation. Modern military and civilian leaders continue to face similar choices between safe conformity and risky innovation, between following established procedures and developing better solutions to complex problems, between protecting their careers and protecting the people who depend on their decisions. Dutch Sullivan's legacy suggests that the courage to think independently and act decisively when circumstances require unconventional responses remains as valuable today as it was during World War II, providing a model for leadership that transcends specific technical applications and addresses the fundamental challenge of balancing individual initiative with institutional requirements. His story proves that one person's willingness to challenge authority in pursuit of better solutions can transform entire organizations and influence countless future decisions, creating ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances that prompted the original innovation. The question that Dutch's example poses to every reader is simple but profound. When faced with a choice between safe conformity and dangerous innovation in pursuit of worthy goals, which path would you choose? And would you have the courage to accept responsibility for the consequences of your decision? Dutch Sullivan never called himself a hero, never sought fame for his achievements, and never claimed that his success was anything more than the result of good training, dedicated teammates, and the willingness to apply basic engineering principles to tactical problems that others had assumed were unsolvable. His story reminds us that heroism often consists not of dramatic gestures, but of quiet competence, applied with moral courage when circumstances require thinking beyond conventional limitations. The mathematics of courage are simple. One person's decision to act according to principle rather than procedure can save lives, change institutions, and inspire future generations to approach their own challenges with the same combination of technical skill and moral determination that characterized Dutch's approach to every problem he encountered. His legacy lives on in every pilot who questions assumptions, every engineer who challenges conventional wisdom, every leader who chooses mission success over personal safety, and every individual who has the courage to act according to conscience when authority conflicts with effectiveness. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that breaking the rules can sometimes be the most patriotic thing you can do. And ask yourself whether you would have had the courage to launch sideways when everyone around you insisted that straight ahead was the only way forward. Comment below and let us know. Would you have followed Dutch's example, or would you have obeyed orders and watched the enemy bombers approach unopposed? The choice between safety and service, between conformity and courage, between following orders and following conscience, remains as relevant today as it was on that October morning in 1943, when one Navy pilot proved that sometimes the best way to honor military discipline is to demonstrate that mission success matters more than personal security.